The first thing Elias Rourke noticed was not the woman, it was the way her coat breathed. She stood at the gate of Rourke Ranch at dusk in the last week of November, 1888, in a coat 2 sizes too large for her, holding herself the particular stillness of a person who has learned that moving too much draws attention. Elias had come out onto the porch expecting the cook he'd hired through a letter and a promise of fair wages. One woman, alone, to feed a ranch of hungry men through a hard winter. That was the arrangement. That was all he'd asked for. Then he saw the hem of that coat shift where no wind was blowing. Then a small boot, scuffed and too thin for the cold, showed itself for half a second beneath the fabric before vanishing again. Then, just at the edge of the collar, a child's hand, knuckles white with the effort of holding on, clutched the coat's inside seam like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Elias Rourke had built a wall around himself 4 winters back and had not once, in all that time, felt it move the way it moved, standing on that porch, watching a woman's coat hide 2 children the way a bird hides its young under a wing when the hawk is already circling. What he did in the next 60 seconds, the question he asked instead of the one he'd meant to ask, would decide not only whether that woman kept a position she badly needed, but whether his own hollow house had any chance left of becoming a home again. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's ride. How many came with you, Mrs. Bell? Elias asked. He kept his voice even. He had learned, running a ranch of 3,100 head and a dozen hard men, that a voice raised too fast closes more doors than it opens, and he did not yet know what he wanted this particular door to do. Clara Bell stood very straight, the way a person stands when straightness is the only dignity left available to them. For a moment she said nothing at all. Then, slowly, she opened the front of the coat just enough. A girl, 6 years old, dark-haired and watchful, stood pressed against her mother's side. A boy, no more than 4, clung to the coat's lining with both fists, his face buried half in the wool, too tired and too cold to do anything but hold on. 3, Clara said. If that means the job is gone. Her voice did not shake. 1, if you'll let me earn supper before you send us away. Elias looked at the girl's watchful eyes, the way she'd already positioned herself half in front of her brother, without being told to. He looked at the boy, hollow-cheeked, clinging rather than crying, the particular quiet of a child who has learned that crying rarely gets a person fed. He looked at Clara Bell's spine, dead straight under a coat that wasn't built for her, built instead to hide 2 people who weighed less than the flour sacks he'd have her cooking with. Come inside, Elias said. All 3 of you. Clara Bell was 31 years old, and she had knocked on 11 doors in the past 4 months that had closed the moment someone inside them saw Annie's small shoulders or heard Toby's cough. Her husband, Daniel Bell, had died the previous winter of a fever that took him in 11 days, leaving her with no land, $40, and 2 children who needed feeding whether or not the world had any particular use for widows. She had taken in washing. She had cooked for a boarding house in Thistle Creek until the owner's wife decided 2 children underfoot were bad for business. She had asked at a hotel, a mercantile, another ranch 2 counties over, and every single time the answer had come the moment the person doing the asking noticed she wasn't alone. We can't take on a family, Mrs. Bell. This is work for a single woman. The children would be a distraction. I'm sorry, truly, but no. She had heard some version of that sentence so many times, it had stopped hurting in the way new things hurt, and started hurting in the duller, more permanent way old wounds hurt, the kind you learn to carry without anyone seeing you carry it. So when word reached her, through a stage driver passing through Thistle Creek, that a rancher named Elias Rourke was paying fair wages for a cook and had said nothing at all about children one way or the other, Clara had made the only choice that still felt like protecting her own. She had wrapped Annie and Toby inside her father's old coat, told them to hold still and hold on, and walked through the gate hoping the arrangement would be settled. The wages agreed, before anyone thought to ask how many mouths she actually meant to feed. She had known, riding out on the freight wagon that morning, that the coat wouldn't hold the secret forever. She had simply hoped it would hold long enough. "Can you cook for hungry men?" Elias asked her, once the children were seated near the stove and Annie had stopped watching the door, like it might still swing shut on them. "I can cook for anyone," Clara said, willing to sit still long enough to be fed. Something in that answer settled something in Elias that he hadn't expected to feel settled that evening. He did not offer charity. He had learned, in his own hard years, that charity offered too quickly humiliates as often as it helps. He offered terms instead, plain and fair. "You'll have wages same as I quoted in the letter. A room with a door that locks, for the three of you, not a storeroom. Your children will eat before my men judge whether they've earned the right to an opinion about it." He paused. "Cook one supper first. Let's see if the arrangement suits us both." Clara Bell had not expected fairness. She had expected, at best, tolerance, and at worst, the same closing door she'd learned to brace for. She nodded once, tightly, the way a person nods when they don't quite trust their voice not to break on gratitude. The Rourke Ranch kitchen told Clara everything she needed to know about how long that house had been running on habit instead of care. Pots sat scorched black along their bottoms, from meat left too long over fire. Nobody was watching. Dried beans had been dumped into a pot without soaking, guaranteeing they'd come out hard as gravel no matter how long they cooked. Flour sat in a barrel gone soft with damp at the edges. Coffee had been boiled past bitter into something closer to punishment. Shelves along the back wall stood exactly as someone had left them years before, untouched, the particular stillness of things nobody had the heart to move. Clara studied it, the way a person studies a problem they already know how to solve. She gave Annie a small, safe task, counting spoons, setting cups in a neat row along the long table, because a child given a job feels less like a burden and more like help, and Annie needed, more than almost anything, to feel useful instead of merely tolerated. Toby she settled near the warmth of the stove with a biscuit heel from her own carpet bag, and he ate it in small, careful bites, the way a child eats when he has learned food does not always come again soon. The cowhands drifted past the kitchen door all evening, and their whispers were not gentle. Rourke hired a woman with children. That was Wyatt Combs, a rider of about 30 who'd worked the ranch 6 years and considered himself entitled to an opinion on most things. "This ain't an orphan house," someone else muttered. "Those little ones won't last a week here," a third voice said, not unkindly, simply certain. Clara heard every word. She had heard worse in gentler towns. She said nothing back. She simply kept working, because she had learned, across 4 months of closed doors, that an argument changes no one's mind half as fast as a full plate does. Her first supper for the Mercer men, tough beef, dried beans, a barrel of damp flour, should have been a disaster by any reasonable measure. Instead, it became the thing every man at that table talked about for a week after. She took the toughest cut of beef in the icebox, the piece nobody wanted, and let it sit low and slow in its own juices until it gave up its toughness entirely. She soaked the beans properly, hours before anyone thought to ask why she was bothering, and cooked them down with a bone and an onion until they came out soft and rich instead of gravel hard. She sifted the damp flour twice and turned what survived into biscuits that rose the way biscuits are supposed to rise. She made coffee the plain, honest way, without letting it boil past its own good sense. For the children, she found a handful of dried apple in the pantry nobody had thought worth using, and turned it into something sweet enough to make Toby's eyes go wide over his own small bowl. The men went quiet halfway through the meal. Plates got scraped clean. Nobody spoke for a long stretch, which in a bunkhouse full of hungry riders is a louder compliment than any word could manage. Amos Pike, the foreman, a man of 56 who'd worked the Rourke Ranch longer than Elias had owned it outright, set his fork down and looked at his empty plate with something close to reverence. "If she cooks like this," Amos said, "those children can hide anywhere on this ranch they please." Wyatt Combs, who'd been the loudest voice against her an hour before, reached for a second biscuit without a shred of embarrassment. "Rourke," he said, mouth half full, "you send that woman off. I'm going with her." A ripple of laughter went round the table, easy and unguarded. The first real laughter that Kitchen had heard in longer than most of the men could remember. Clara did not smile too wide. She kept one hand on Toby's small shoulder and the other stirring the last of the broth, and let the work speak for her the way it always had. Elias watched all of it from the head of the table and understood, for the first time since the letter had arrived asking for a cook, that he had not been deciding whether to feed 3 extra mouths. He had been deciding whether to let something back into his house that he'd spent 4 years keeping carefully, deliberately out. Over the weeks that followed, the Rourke Ranch changed in ways too small to name individually and too large, together, to miss. Clara had breakfast on the table before the men were even properly awake, and the men rode out better for it, steadier, less short-tempered, the particular calm that comes from a full stomach and a warm start to a cold morning. She taught them, without ever once lecturing, not to waste good fat or good bone, the same way she'd taught herself across 4 hard months of having nothing to waste. Annie took to setting the table every evening without being asked, and within 2 weeks she had learned which cup belonged to which man without anyone telling her twice. Toby stopped hiding behind his mother's skirts by the 2nd week and started, instead, carrying kindling in from the woodpile in an armload only slightly too big for him, chin up, proud of the work the way small children are proud of work that makes them feel, for once, useful instead of underfoot. The bunkhouse men pretended not to care about either child, in the particular way hard men pretend not to care about things that have already gotten past their guard. Jesse Cobb, the youngest hand on the ranch at 19, carved Toby a small wooden horse out of scrap pine over 3 quiet evenings and left it on the boy's cot without a word of explanation. Wyatt Combs, who'd complained the loudest that first night, fixed a broken strap on Annie's shoe with the same care he gave his own saddle leather, and never once mentioned having done it. Amos Pike, without announcing the habit, started checking whether the children had eaten before he ever sat down to his own plate, the quiet, self-appointed duty of a man who'd raised children of his own once, long ago, and buried the memory of it somewhere he rarely visited. Elias repaired the small room off the kitchen himself. New hinges, a door that locked properly, a stove flue patched so the room held its heat, so Clara and the children would sleep somewhere that was truly theirs, instead of a storeroom converted at short notice. He did the work in the evenings, after supper, without saying much about it, the way a man says the things that matter most through his hands, instead of his mouth. And then, on a gray afternoon in the 2nd week of December, he opened a door he had not opened in 4 years. It was a small room at the end of the hall, meant once for a child who had never lived long enough to fill it. Elias stood in the doorway a long moment before he let Clara see inside. A narrow bed frame, a shelf built for toys that had never arrived, curtains gone the color of old paper from 4 winters of sun with no one to notice them fading. "This room was supposed to hear a child once," Elias said. His voice had none of its usual steadiness in it. Clara did not rush to comfort him. She had learned, across her own hard year, that grief handled too quickly gets buried instead of healed. She let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. "Rooms remember what they were meant for," she said finally. Elias looked at her for a long moment, something loosening behind his eyes that had been tight for 4 winters running. By the 3rd week of December, Toby had begun sleeping in that room, the shelf finally holding a small carved horse instead of standing empty, and neither Elias nor Clara spoke of what that meant, because some things settle their own meaning without needing to be said aloud. The small gestures kept building, quiet as snowfall, each one adding to a drift neither of them had quite decided to call anything yet. Elias built a shelf exactly where Clara had once mentioned, only in passing, that the pantry could use one. Clara began leaving coffee warm on the back of the stove for whenever Elias came in from late work in the barn, without either of them remarking on the habit once it started. Elias noticed, more than once, that Clara filled the children's bowls before her own, and often skipped her own plate entirely when supplies ran thin, and began, without announcement, simply putting more food in front of her at the end of each meal until she stopped being able to refuse it gracefully. Clara mended a tear in his coat one evening without mentioning she'd done it. The same quiet economy of care her own hands gave to everything they touched. Elias rode into Thistle Creek one gray Saturday and came back with a small pair of mittens sized for a 4-year-old's hands, telling Amos gruffly they'd simply been extra at the mercantile, a lie so thin even Amos didn't bother pretending to believe it. Annie asked him once, straightening cups at the table, whether the house used to have children in it. The question landed harder than she could have known to intend it. Elias set down the cup he was holding and after a moment answered her honestly, in the plain, unhurried way he answered most things a child asked him. "It was supposed to," he said, "a long time ago." Annie considered that with the particular gravity 6-year-olds bring to things they don't fully understand, but sense the weight of anyway. "I'm glad it does now," she said, and went back to setting cups, leaving Elias standing in the kitchen with something in his chest he hadn't expected a 6-year-old's plain sentence to loosen. For a long while, formality stood between Elias and Clara, the way a fence stands between 2 pastures that both know, eventually, the gate will open. He called her Mrs. Bell, she called him Mr. Rourke. Neither of them rushed past it, because both of them had been burned before by trusting warmth that turned out to be temporary, and the distance felt, for a time, safer than the alternative. It was the children, without meaning to, who wore that fence down fastest. Toby called Elias "Sir" the first week, careful and formal, the way a boy speaks to a man he isn't sure of yet. By the 2nd month, it had softened to "Mr. Rourke," said easily, without the old caution behind it. Then one evening in January, tired and half asleep at the supper table, Toby started to say something else entirely, the first syllable of a word that began the same way Papa begins, before catching himself, going quiet, and finishing instead with "Mr. Rourke" in a smaller voice than usual. Nobody at that table remarked on it, but Elias's hand, Clara noticed, had gone very still around his coffee cup for the length of a full breath before he picked it back up. Clara worried, some nights, that she had no right to any of it. Not the room, not the wages, not the quiet warmth building at that table. She had spent so long being refused that kindness, when it finally arrived, felt less like comfort and more like something she expected to be taken back at any moment. She said as much to Elias one evening, plainly, the way she said most things. "I keep waiting for the door to close," she admitted. "It always has before." "Not this one," Elias said. It wasn't a large promise. It was, for a man like him, the largest one he knew how to make. The trouble, when it came, arrived from town, rather than the sky, though the sky would follow soon enough behind it. Word had reached Thistle Creek, the way word always reaches a small town eventually, that Elias Rourke had a widow and 2 children living at his ranch under one roof, unmarried, unrelated by blood, and the county's relief committee did not consider that arrangement any of its business to ignore. Mrs. Mercy Trowbridge arrived on a cold Tuesday in a hired buggy, a woman of perhaps 50 with a face that had seen genuine hardship in her own life and had, as a result, developed strong opinions about how other people ought to manage theirs. She was not cruel. She believed, sincerely, that she was doing right by 2 children whose situation looked, from the outside, precarious and improper. "A cattle ranch is no place to raise 2 young children permanently, Mrs. Bell," she said, seated stiffly at the very table Annie had set an hour before. "No proper home, no schooling nearby, no woman of standing to see to their upbringing but yourself, working as hired help in a bachelor's house. The committee would be remiss not to consider whether they'd be better placed, perhaps at the children's home in Cheyenne, or with respectable families closer to town." Clara felt the old fear rise in her, sharper than it had been in months, because she had, without quite admitting it to herself, stopped bracing for this particular blow. "They have never slept hungry here," Clara said, her voice steady even as her hands, out of Mrs. Trowbridge's sight beneath the table, were not. "Warm meals," Mrs. Trowbridge said, not unkindly, simply certain of her own logic, "are not the same as a home." The sentence landed on Elias like a physical thing. He had told himself, across 4 years of careful avoidance, that a ranch running smoothly was the same as a house properly lived in. Mrs. Trowbridge's plain words made the difference between those 2 things impossible to keep ignoring. He said nothing that afternoon. But something in him had started, quietly, to gather itself toward an answer he wasn't ready to give out loud yet. The storm came the 2nd week of January, early and hard even by Wyoming standards, closing the road to Thistle Creek within a single night, and stranding Mrs. Trowbridge's own hired buggy driver on the return trip he'd meant to make before the weather turned. The driver arrived at the Rourke Ranch half-frozen, leading a second stranded traveler behind him. An elderly peddler caught on the same road, coughing badly, in need of warmth before anything else could be done for him. Mrs. Trowbridge herself, delayed by a second visit she'd meant to pay before returning to town, found herself stranded at the very ranch she'd come to question 2 days before. Clara fed all of them with the same calm, unhurried skill she had brought to that kitchen from the first night. Broth first for the peddler's cough, then beans, then bread, without a single word about who deserved what. The cowhands, without needing to be told, protected the children through the worst of it in ways too natural to have been arranged. When the bunkhouse door blew open under the wind's full weight, Amos Pike stepped between it and Annie without seeming to think about the movement at all. When Toby wandered too near the drafty hallway, Jesse Cobb simply scooped him up and carried him back to the warm kitchen, tucking him against one shoulder the way a man carries something he's decided, somewhere along the way, he'd fight for. "Those children," Wyatt Combs said to no one in particular, watching Annie carry a cup of water carefully across the room to the shivering peddler, "belong here more than the rest of us do." Annie, for her part, remembered exactly where Clara kept the dry cloths without being asked, and brought one straight to the peddler's shoulders before anyone else had thought to look for it. Toby, small as he was, kept carrying kindling in from the covered woodpile all through the worst of the storm, chin set with the same stubborn pride he'd carried it with every day since he'd first stopped hiding behind his mother's coat. Mrs. Trowbridge watched all of it, watched 2 children who were not neglected, not underfoot, not a burden anyone tolerated, but simply and thoroughly part of the working, breathing life of that household, and said very little for the better part of a day. It was on the storm's second night, once the peddler had been settled and the driver fed and warmed, that Mrs. Trowbridge raised the matter again, more gently this time but no less firmly. "I still cannot, in good conscience, recommend this as a permanent arrangement, Mrs. Bell, without some proof that the children have a real home here. Not simply a well-fed one." Elias stood up from the table then, and every man in that kitchen went quiet, the way men go quiet when someone who rarely raises his voice is finally about to use it. "The first night they came here," Elias said, "those children hid under her coat, because every door before mine had taught them to hide." His voice was plain, unhurried, the way it was when he meant every single word of a thing. "They don't hide here anymore, Mrs. Trowbridge. That ought to tell you what kind of home this is." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone quieter, steadier, closer to something like a vow than a defense. "If a home is a place where children are fed, warmed, protected, corrected when they need it, and missed the moment they leave the room, then this ranch has been their home since the first snowfall. I'd stake my name on that before any committee in the territory." Amos Pike came to stand beside him without a word, simply present, the way a foreman stands beside a man he's decided to back without needing to be asked. Jesse Cobb set Toby's small wooden horse down on the table between them, a plain, silent piece of evidence that needed no further explanation. Annie, watching from beside her mother, reached over and took Clara's hand. Mrs. Trowbridge looked around that kitchen for a long moment, at the cowhands, at the wooden horse, at a girl holding her mother's hand without fear of it being the last time she got to, and understood, finally, that whatever she had come looking for evidence of, she had found the opposite of it instead. "I was wrong to doubt it," she said, quietly, and did not raise the matter again. The storm broke on the third day, leaving behind the particular hush that follows a hard Wyoming winter storm, the whole valley white and silent, and, for once, entirely at peace. The stranded travelers left for town once the road cleared, and Mrs. Trowbridge shook Clara's hand at the door in a way that closed the matter for good. That evening, once the kitchen had emptied and the children were asleep in the small room off the hall, Elias found Clara alone at the long table, bread rising under a cloth in the lamplight, snow still falling soft and steady past the window. "I asked if you could cook for my men," Elias said. "I should have asked whether you could teach an empty house how to be a home again." Clara let that sit a moment, the way she let most things sit before trusting them. "I came here with 2 children under my coat," she said finally, "because I had nowhere safe left to put them. Somewhere along the way, this house became the first place I didn't have to hide anything at all." Elias didn't ask her to stay as a cook. He was careful about that, the way he'd been careful with her wages and her locked door from the very first evening. He asked her to stay as the woman his house, his children in every way that mattered, and his own life had quietly rebuilt themselves around. Clara agreed. Not out of desperation, not out of gratitude rushed ahead of itself, but out of the plain, hard-won certainty of a woman who had finally found a door that stayed open. By spring, the Rourke Ranch had become known, in a county that once knew it mainly for its cattle, for its table, and for the sound of children's laughter carrying across the yard. Annie set cups at supper without being asked, the way she had from that very first week, and had long since stopped watching the door the way she used to. Toby ran through the ranch yard most afternoons with his small wooden horse held tight in one fist. Chin up, no longer hollow-cheeked, no longer careful in the way children are careful when they've learned not to expect enough. The cowhands treated both children as plainly and completely as family, Amos Pike included, who had taken to teaching Toby to whistle for the dogs on Sunday afternoons. Elias no longer avoided the small room at the end of the hall. He passed its open door every evening on his way to check the stove, and every evening it held, instead of silence, a sleeping boy and a lit lamp turned low. Clara planted a kitchen garden that April, thick and orderly, the same care she gave everything. The ranch house, hollow for 4 long winters, was hollow no longer. A man had hired a widow to cook for his men and found 2 children hiding beneath her coat. He had believed that first evening he was deciding whether to keep 3 extra mouths fed through 1 hard winter. He had not yet understood that he was opening the door to 3 hearts instead, and that by the time winter finally loosened its hold on Thistle Creek, that ranch would not know how it had ever managed to live without them. This has been Satellite Stories. If this story warmed something in you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, did you notice the coat moving before Elias did? There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Until next time, keep riding.